Thank you so much for the introduction. I hope everyone can hear me okay and that you can see the presentation. So please let me know if there's any issue. So thank you so much for everyone who's here at the conference, and thank you to the organizing committee for putting together this wonderful conference to talk about animals and animal ethics so close to the spring equinox when so many animals and plants are coming back to life. So I really think the timing is quite perfect. And as our panel chair has mentioned, I'm going to talk about a critique of hunting sports in children's literature by female ornithologists of the 19th century or the Victorian period. So these were women who were pioneering scientists who studied birds. And this is part of the research I started as a member of the European project EnviroCitizen, and I began working on women ornithologists of the Victorian period, their nature writing and texts mainly published in England and the United States, because I come from a background in English studies. And I've lately been focusing on Victorian children's literature and environmental education. So I'm looking at didactic texts that were part of bird protection campaigns that were led by women and that involved children. So as we're going to see, these texts addressed quite urgent topics, and there are issues that are still relevant today because millions of birds were being killed every year, and this was leading to the extinction of some species. Other species were driven to near extinction. So these books helped raise awareness against hunting because it really was in the national interest to stop this huge loss of biodiversity that we're still dealing with nowadays. So I'm really interested in how ornithological literature, so writing about birds, allowed women to participate in the public sphere at a time when this was very difficult for women, for example, through animal welfare activism or through their contributions to natural science, because they published ornithological studies. And although I've mostly been paying attention to the role of women and girls in early conservation movements, I've also been wondering about the boys in these children's books, because young men had a prominent role in ecological destruction in the 19th century. And these women didn't shy away from pointing this out in their writing, as we're going to see. And they offered new role models for eco-ethical boyhood, or wild boyhood, as I called it in the title, that are quite different from what was established by 19th century generals, as we're going to see. So in these texts, women openly encouraged boys to assume responsibility and accountability for bird slaughter. And by doing so, they anticipated what we now call environmental education, because they knew that reforming boys was probably the most effective way of changing the men of the future. Now, through their writing, these women were responding to a historical context of huge environmental change and huge environmental destruction. There were many transformations in the relationship between human beings and nature, mainly due to the Industrial Revolution and the negative impact it had on nature. And as a result of this, there was also the beginning of the first environmental activism groups. And at the same time, this period was characterized by not just by this changing view of nature, but also by new conceptions of childhood that had begun in the 18th century with the Romantic movement that perceived childhood as a state of innocence, a sort of paradise where human beings lived in harmony with animals and nature, but eventually lost that ability as they grew older because they would be corrupted by the industrialized adult world. And this idea triggered very important changes in education in the 19th century, because it included a new awareness of how important it is to have contact with nature for healthy human development. So the idea was that children are innately interested in nature because of this romantic notion, and this interest should be maintained and encouraged as they grow older. So as a result, kids were encouraged to join animal welfare groups like Bands of Mercy or bird protection campaigns like the Dickey Society in England and the Audubon Society in America, which, by the way, was founded and led by women. And these new ideas were also reflected in children's literature that often presented similar messages about how important it is to defend nature and other than human creatures. However, as we're going to see, not all children were encouraged to do this in the same way. So there was a strong gendered bias, and usually girls were expected to feel pity for animals, and boys were expected to want to hurt animals. And this was even tolerated with a sort of, boys will be boys attitudes, that they're just being naughty. And we can even see that in some women's writing of the period. So even in children's book, we have this very large trend at the time to present girls as the protectors of wildlife and boys as the destroyers of nature. So there were many moralistic nature stories in which boys are converted from harming animals into protecting them, and they are convinced by girls to do so. So for instance, in Susanna Watts' The Animal's Friend, we have a children's book in which girls ask boys not to torture birds. So they're restraining boys from killing birds. And there's usually a dialogue where the girl takes the animal's side and confronts the boy. And here in this book, the author highlights the feminine duty to control masculine hunting instincts and violent instincts. And of course, to a certain extent, these stories reflected a reality because men were mostly the ones who were exploiting nature. But these representations of girls as perfect angels was also very influenced by gendered attitudes to animal suffering in the 19th century. So we know that gender roles at the time were defined by what we now know as the ideology of the separate spheres. So we have the public sphere of masculine action, assertiveness, productivity, and then the private sphere of feminine passivity, emotion, domesticity, and care, which was known as the ideal of the angel in the house. So this idea that women were expected to act as caregivers for innocent creatures, as we see in this picture of a woman holding a bird, a response to this feminine sphere that was supposed to be complementary to traditionally masculine attributes like boldness and violence. So women would have a sort of civilizing mission in society where they were supposed to restrain men from being violent. And this is why we have in many children's books of the 19th century, we have this double standard where girls are reminded of this feminine duty to protect animals from boys. And at the same time, didactic texts for boys, so gender-specific texts, openly encouraged hunting, animal baiting, and other forms of cruelty that were perceived as a supposedly healthy part of their upbringing. This is because hunting sports were presented as really essential elements in the construction of masculinity. In the Victorian period, they were encouraged from a young age. Boys were soon taught how to use a gun, and it was considered necessary to attain full manhood. So it was a sort of rite of passage. And this idea really persisted into the 20th century, and we still can see the impact today. So, for example, in this quote by the naturalist Aldo Leopold, we see a very clear instance of this. He says that a man may not care for gold and still be human, but the man who does not like to see, hunt, photograph, or otherwise outwit birds and animals is hardly normal. So we see here that hunting is absolutely necessary for any normal man at the time, and it's also connected to a desire to capture birds, to dominate and manipulate nature, so to establish a sense of superiority, to maintain that hierarchy that our previous speaker has already explained. Also, 19th century hunter narratives are characterized as sometimes tainted by metaphors of sexual domination and other analogies that connected women and animals, especially birds, by the way. And many ecofeminist scholars have noted how similar tropes reveal this association between nature and women as secondary to culture and men. And this was used to justify violence against both in androcentric culture. We also see in this picture that hunting was connected to imperialist notions of, this conquest of difference, of otherness, of the unknown. And that idea was also connected to the notion of hunting for science. This was the main method in natural science in the 19th century. So, for example, most male ornithologists would shoot birds to then dissect the corpses and analyze their anatomy. So that was the main methodology, and it was later challenged by female ornithologists, as we're going to see. These ideas that I mentioned about hunting even appeared in children's culture. So, for example, in journals like the Youth's Companion and other magazines of the time. And this children's press was often gender specific. So, for example, we have the boys' own paper, whose content was very different from the girls' own paper. And in the boys' own paper, we have this normalization of hunting activities, as well as other toxic behavior among boys, like fighting, wrestling, and so on. But we find very different themes in children's literature by women ornithologists of the time who addressed the problem of hunting, especially regarding the plumage trade. The plumage trade was a trend in the 19th century that was causing the killing of millions of birds to make feather hats, which were very popular at the time, and other feather accessories. So these women pointed out the need to approach bird protection by being critical of gender roles. Because if men were the ones causing bird extinction by hunting, by selling feather hats, they were the ones who should be held accountable, instead of just expecting women to do all the work and exert their gentle influence on men to convert them. And one of the first women to highlight this descent of bird populations because of hunting was the pioneering naturalist Susan Fenimore Cooper. She was the first woman to publish nature writing in the United States through this book that we see here, Rural Hours. And in another text that's less known, in Birds Then and Now, she draws attention to this problem of bird extinction because she observed the landscape and she noticed that she saw less birds every year. And she identifies the feather trade as the main cause behind this. But instead of using this traditional gendered ideas that we've seen, she provides scientific arguments based on empirical data to denounce this destructive impact of hunting. She exposes it as a typically masculine activity that's encouraged since boyhood. And she mentions, for instance, how young boys were allowed to shoot birds in spring, so during nesting season. And this meant that birds wouldn't be able to lay eggs, or the eggs would be orphaned, and then the chicks would starve because they wouldn't have their parents to feed them. So this would definitely reduce the avian population in a certain area. And although Cooper does appeal to emotional arguments like compassion, she doesn't perpetuate this moralistic tone that we've seen in other didactic texts. So she doesn't ask girls to convince boys to not kill birds. Instead, she highlights the impact of the disappearance of birds on the landscape. So she wonders what would happen if all birds became extinct, how could that eventually affect human beings who are also part of ecosystems? And this is relevant because she's applying her reasoning abilities and her analytical skills that supposedly belongs to this masculine public sphere. So by doing that, she's disrupting these binary oppositions that we've seen before in 19th century gender roles to denounce hunting. And we find very similar arguments in other texts by women ornithologists against hunting. For instance, Nelsha Blanchard published several children's books addressed to boys and girls, as we can see in the quote. So she's trying to involve children as agents of change in public attitudes to animal suffering, regardless of gender. So she's addressing the text to boys and girls. And in Bird Neighbors, which is one of these books, she denounces, much like Susan Fenimore Cooper, she denounces hunting as a manly or boyish activity. And she also mentions how girls were being, not girls, birds were being killed for the feather trade and for ornithological studies. And to struggle against this scientific hunting, she suggests new methodologies for the study of birds. So she proposes to use binoculars and the scientific camera to observe birds closely without having to kill birds. So she proves that this scientific hunting is unnecessary and that science can be compatible with animal ethics. And she also writes about this in Birds Every Child Should Know, where she actually sets Theodore Roosevelt as a role model for male bird protection. Roosevelt, as we know, was president of the United States at the time, and he was also a naturalist and an early conservationist. So she argues that caring for animals doesn't keep the president from being what she calls a strong, manly man. So she's simultaneously perpetuating and challenging gender stereotypes. And she does this to encourage bird watching as a healthy outdoor activity for the correct physical and psycho-emotional development of children. This was part of larger educational reforms in the 19th century, like the nature study movement that was linked to this idea of wild boyhood, this idea of healthy, strong children living in harmony with the landscape. And again, instead of presenting girls as universal caregivers that have to set an example for boys, Blanchard addresses the message specifically to boys, and she tells them that if they learn about birds and avoid hurting animals, they can one day become president. So at the time, this was probably one of the most prestigious role models for young men in America. So again, she's disrupting these gendered spheres that sustained hunter discourse, and she's telling boys that there's no need to be violent and to be a hunter, to be, as she calls it, a manly man. And this argument was taken a step further by Olive Thorne Miller, who was a member of the Audubon Society and who also published children's book to raise environmental awareness. So, for example, in her children's book of birds, she encourages kids to watch live birds in the natural habitat instead of shooting them to dissect the corpses. So again, she's arguing against scientific hunting. And she also talks about this in her book, Birdways, in which she wonders how men with hearts tender to suffering can get so carried away by the excitement of the hunt to lose all empathy towards other creatures. So again, we see a woman ornithologist who is questioning gendered stereotypes about interspecies encounters. She argues that men can also have tenderness of heart and be gentle to animals, and that is the emotional factor that should be addressed to denounce hunting sports. So according to Miller, it's not women's responsibility to control men's violent impulses. And this leads to another relevant consideration. And she wonders about how many hunters have confessed to a return to their better selves the moment the chase was won. And as scholars like Marcy Keel have pointed out, this aspect of hunter discourse bears similarities with the discourse of sexual assault, and it reveals possible ecofeminist concerns about how women and animals have been exposed to intersecting types of violence. So in this context, a boy that hunts might be more likely to later become a man who enforces patriarchal or androcentric domination in other ways. The author also wonders how this short madness is different from the sudden rage which would lead a man to lift his hand against another human being. And this is an important idea very often discussed in 19th century education, and it had been a concern since the 18th century, as we can see in William Hobbitt's book, Four Stages of Cruelty. And the idea was that cruelty against animals by children would later be manifested into interpersonal violence. So boys who were encouraged to hunt from a young age would be more likely to become violent adults in the future. And this is why, according to Miller, teaching empathy towards fellow creatures would lead to a more peaceful society as a whole for everyone. And this is an idea also addressed by the last author I'm including today, by Mabel Osgood Wright. She was a well-known leader of the Audubon movement, and in her children's book, Citizen Bird, she proposed to include the bird as a citizen in American society, so as a living being with rights and responsibilities. And by responsibilities, she refers to all the things that birds do that benefit other creatures, including humans. So she points to this balance between beings in ecosystems and to how we all have a role to play in that balance. So we're all connected. And like the other authors I've mentioned, she denounces hunting, egg collecting, and other ways of harming birds, specifying that it's usually boys who engage in these activities. So here, for example, we have an anecdote about a boy who goes egg collecting, and then he tells his friends about where to find nests to get eggs. So all the boys start stealing eggs. So that means that the birds leave the farm because it's no longer a safe space for them to build their nests. And if the birds leave the farms, the farmers' crops will be ruined because the birds were playing a very important role in that ecosystem. They were feeding on the insects that would otherwise feed on the crops. So by telling us this, Wright shows us that even small actions have an impact on the environment. So if all the boys steal eggs from nests, the birds won't be there to eat the insects during harvest season, and the insects will thrive and damage the crops. So she's showing us how we're all connected and part of ecosystems. We're not separated from nature. And this is an interesting approach because, again, this author uses arguments based on empirical data. So she's again destabilizing this reason and emotion binary that we have seen in the separate spheres ideology. And according to her, this was a crucial step in bird protection campaigns led by women, because female activists were often accused of being supposedly too emotional. Their rage over animal suffering was often dismissed as hysteria. They were often criticized in the press because of this, so they were not taken seriously. So for the women of the Audubon Society, it was necessary to prove that they were capable of rational thought and analytical skills. So to prove that they had these so-called masculine attributes that would allow them to be taken seriously in the public sphere if they wanted to have a political impact regarding bird protection. But above all, they proved that their scientific approach was compatible with an ethics of care, and that being rational didn't exclude emotional bonding with animals. So once again, we see how women used ornithological writing to question these binary oppositions of 19th century dominant culture and to challenge the dichotomies that configured women and animals as supposedly inferior in the androcentric hierarchy. So in this way, the deconstruction of the hunter discourse shed light on how patriarchal and speciesist forces intersect in androcentric systems of domination, and how these systems can be taken down by offering alternative masculinity standards. So thank you so much for your attention. I tried to stick to the time. That's why I was going a bit fast. So thank you so much. This is just my reference list in case anyone's interested.